we've got our flask, which has a registration mark that you always line up. It's also got this awesome little gap here so that if it's too tightly closed, you can always wedge the back of your tweezers in there and lever it open. Very handy. So the flask has two parts. It's got your male part and your female part. So the male part's the part that has the lip that's exposed. Female part has the lip that's recessed. So we always start on the male side. Got all my clay here and all my tools, so let me just make some room. Alrighty. So when you're packing your flask, your male flask, you always start on your male. This is the top of your flask. You always pack it from behind. So you flip it down and pack it from behind. So that lip is face down. Just get some clay and smush it in there. And you've got your hammer so that you can compact that clay. So the biggest reason why we flip this flask over and pack it from behind is so that when we're compressing it with this hammer and we accidentally hit this aluminium frame and damage it, we're damaging the outside, not the lip that we need to stay nice and clean. If you damage the lip, your two halves are not going to fit together properly. So just for the longevity of your flask, flip it over and pack it from behind. Alright, so if you have any excess clay on the back, scrape it off. Because you want this surface to be flush. You don't want it concave, you don't want it convex, you want it flat. That gives it nice strength. So if you're pushing something in there, it's not going to give way. And it's not rocking around. Alright, so we've got this smooth, flat surface. And we're going to talcum powder it up. So the talcum powder is just a little barrier so that when you put the two clay halves together, they don't stick. But also it helps your object not to stick to the clay as well. It's like a little lubricant. Alrighty. Let's do this design. Alright. Place your ring design in. Press it in so it's about halfway. I've compacted my clay quite a bit, so it's a bit of work pressing this object in. If you find that it is quite hard, you can always use your ruler to help disperse that pressure. Alright, so I think that's about halfway. Alright, let's put the top on, put the female part of the flask on. Make sure those registration marks are lining up, really important. Alright, so let's put in some loose crumbly clay first. So just break into little bits. Using your fingers, press that clay nice and tight around your object. This just makes sure that you've got clay really nicely packed all around your object, picking up all of that detail. And there's no gaps. Alright, and now I can just grab a handful and just smush it in. Alrighty. Compact it. Okay. Remove any excess material, because again, you don't want it concave, you don't want it convex, you want it flat. Nice and flush. Alrighty. Now pull apart your flask nice and evenly. You don't want to screw it open because that'll disturb that perfect negative space you've just created. So open it up nice and even, just like that. And there we go. So we've got our two halves come apart nice and evenly. There's a little bit of breakage. I'm not too worried though. Alright. Using some tweezers, let's just get this guy out. There we go. A little bit of breakage, but that's okay. We can just push that back. Alrighty, so now to do the sprue hole and funnel. So that's just a way of letting the silver come into this negative space and fill it. So I always like to do my sprue hole and funnel on the female side, but everybody's different. You don't have to do it one side or the other. It's not better or worse. I just have gotten used to doing it this way, and this is my preference, but other people like to do it on the male side. Doesn't really matter. So I've got my big fat poker that I'm going to push through down here, all the way through and out. So this is where the silver is going to be let in to the flask, into the mould. So by pressing this big fat poker in there, I've disturbed the clay and distorted the design a little bit. So good thing to have your object handy, because you can always just pop that back in and crisp up that design again. And then get it out. Alrighty. So I've got my hole, my sprue hole. Now I need to do my funnel. So this is to help channel that silver down into this hole. Alright, so I've got my little knifey tool here, and I'm going to carve out a funnel. So the funnel has to be quite deep. Has to be almost breaking through that negative space, but not quite. So the diameter of the hole doesn't matter so much. How wide you make it doesn't really matter, as long as you can aim for it when you're pouring molten metal in there. It's the depth that's important, because you don't want this silver bottlenecking any longer than it has to, because as it's bottlenecking, it's cooling down rapidly. So if we can stop it from doing that for any longer than it has to, it's just a positive for us. So I'm getting pretty deep with my funnel. Let's just check that hole. So you kind of fill it in a bit when you're creating that funnel. Little loose bits of clay fall in. Alright, that's looking pretty good. You have to have a clean funnel. You can't have any loose bits of clay floating around in there, because you don't want loose bits of clay to follow your silver in and create really gross porosity, whether that's inside of your metal, creating a weak point, or whether it's marring the surface of your design. Either way, you don't want it. So just clean up that funnel. I like to use the back of my paintbrush, because it's a big smooth surface that I can roll around the inside of that funnel and smush all those loose bits of clay down. And I'm going to clean up that hole again, because again, you want the hole nice and clean. Alright, so we've got a pretty deep funnel and a fairly wide hole, which is good. So your hole has to be about 5 to 6 millimeters. If you go smaller than that, then the silver's bottlenecking and cooling down really quickly. So if you've got 5 to 6 millimeter wide diameter hole, then it means that your metal has enough time to fill your flask. So I'm just cleaning up that design again. Alright, so the last thing you do before you close this flask up and cast is create air vents. So you always place your air vents on the same side that your funnel and sprue hole are. You don't put it on the opposite side. There's no point. It won't work. So you have to do it on the side that has your sprue hole and funnel. Alrighty, so you place your air vents at the points that you think are the hardest for the metal to reach. So in this case, I would say it'd be here and here would be the hardest to reach positions, and that's where I'm going to place my air vents, because as the air is escaping this flask, it's creating a vacuum which is actually sucking that silver in behind it. So the silver rushes to fill that negative space. So I like to do a little channel and then poke straight out, just like that. And you can always open that up a little bit so it's really obviously there. And I do the same on this side. Little channel and then poke out. So I've got my air vents, I've got my funnel and sprue hole and a good negative space. So it's ready to cast. You just close that, making sure the registration marks are lining up, and then you're good to go. Casting time. So I've got my sprue hole and funnel, I've got my air vents, and I'm good to go. So I've got my sprue hole, my funnel, and my air vents. So I'm good to cast. Close up your flask, making sure those registration marks are lining up, also making sure that your air holes are visible. If you can't see them, it means they're not there and they're not going to work. It's good to go.